life care and medical ethics. Our objectives would be to recognize the signs and symptoms of dying process. How do we have to develop an individualized care plan during end of life? What are the principles of prescribing at end of life, and what are the common issues and regarding medical ethics in palliative? When we talk about end of life is a multidisciplinary term and is an approach towards a whole person care. So it is for patients who are with advanced, progressive, incurable, life limiting illnesses, so that as long as they are alive, they should be able to possibly live well, having a proper quality of life. So it not just extends to a patient who's dying, but also to their next family members and caregivers. The ICMR definition would be an approach to a terminally ill patients that is actually shifting the focus from symptom control to focus to symptom control, comfort, dignity, quality of life, and quality of dying, rather than treatment aimed at cure or prolongation of life. So, as we can see that this is the disease trajectory wherein palliative care can be involved, wherein initially when the curative treatment has started, introduction of palliative care in order to manage the initial symptoms, and gradually as the disease directed treatment has been come to almost zero, that is when a patient enters the end of life care. So some say quantitatively end of life care as a 12-month or a 6 month, but roughly it is around 6 to 12 months depend, because each literature says different values. And then end of life care not just comprises about the last few months of life, but also it includes death and bereavement support as well. What would be our principles of a good death? So trying to have the ability in understanding when death is approaching, have physical symptoms well controlled, and right to die in a dignified manner at the place of choice without needlessly prolonging with artificial means. So you should understand when the death is coming, have a control of what happens, afford dignity and privacy, adequate symptom control, be in the form of pain, refractory nausea, delirium, breathlessness. Have a choice of control where death occurs, access to information whenever necessary, access to any spiritual or emotional support whenever needed. If there's any close by hospice, having an access to that, able to issue advance directives so as to who has to be present at the time of death, and when it is time to say goodbye, having a control of the timing, and unnecessary prolonging have to be avoided. So like I said, these are the components of good death, wherein pain and symptom management, proper decision making, preparing for death, that is having proper contacts of what they have to do after the event occurs, completion of death, other contributing factors, that is dealing with the family, and affirming the whole person as a whole. So what would be the steps of an end of life process, and how do we develop an individualized care plan? Say, suppose you encounter a patient who is in end of life and the patient is about to expire in like a few days. Then you have to recognize that the patient is actually in the process of dying, and ensure that a proper decision making is done, and initiate this pathway with the family, saying that the patient might actually go into this phase, and we expect that the patient might pass away a little sooner, and then explain them regarding so as to what anticipatory things that they can encounter during that course, what is the scope of palliative in that difficult time, providing an after death care plan and medical review meeting and bereavement support. So this is the 6 step approach in end of life process. One is to identify, that is when to initiate and whom all have to be there when you initiate, and assess any symptoms, be it physical, non-physical. Usually at end of life, non-physical symptoms will be difficult to address, like psychological things are difficult to address, but as much as possible try to ensure that you at least acknowledge such non-physical things. Plan, that is review the medication chart, unnecessary medications have to be removed, and provide proper symptom control. Ensure that there are dedicated staff available round the clock to attend the needs of both the patient and family, because every new symptom that is popping up at end of life, family becomes worried so as to why this is actually happening. And then reassess and reflect the care process, if it has happened properly, if there are any gaps in the process. So, what are the stages of care? One is identifying the terminal stage of illness, facilitating early discussion so that a realistic expectation has been set between the patient and the family, enabling patients to have a dignified dying process, that is ensuring all levels, be it physical, emotional, social, spiritual, and ethical, all of these are addressed, empowering the patients in deciding their treatment, that is including a holistic approach of both family and the treating clinical team, and creating awareness among staff, empowering them with the skills so as to how they have to communicate and documentation during this process. So this is the six-step approach, wherein step one is discussing at discussions with the end of life when it is actually near, trying to have an open and honest communication, and assessing the care plan, that is the needs of the patient usually change every other day during end of life. So during that time, agreed care plan so as to address that particular need has to be done. Coordination of care, so both not just the patient and family but also the different clinical teams that are treating the patient, or you have any other interdisciplinary management happening on having a coordination between the entire team and trying to deliver a high quality service, that is in all the settings, be it in the hospital, at home care, or at community level, trying to provide a quality care. Say suppose the patient cannot come till the hospital, trying to provide a teleconsultation or attaching them to a local home based service, or a hospice is something that is mentioned here. And then care in the last days of life, that is identifying the dying phase, identifying their needs, preferred choices, place of death, supporting both the patient and the family caregivers, recognition of the wishes regarding end of life resuscitation, and care after death. So it is not just death is not the end, even after death care, that is called the bereavement, that is trying to acknowledge and provide support to the family, is also equally important. So throughout all of these phases, trying to have proper access to spiritual care, supporting the patient and their family members is equally important. Under Guideline 1, wherein physician's objective and subjective assessment of medical futility and dying process, which means that whenever a patient is identified and recognized as further there is no treatment that is possible, which means a medical futility has been established, try to ensure that this is recognized early by the expertise team, and then you have to involve the other palliative service team so that both of the clinicians are available during the process of declaring a medical futility. And what are the signs of usual a patient who is dying? One is in the blood pressure, where there's a fall in the blood pressure. There's a fall in a core body temperature, where hands and feet becomes very cold, and altered breathing pattern, that is a chine strokes breathing. The skin color becomes grayish, a mottling will be seen. Pale color can also be seen, and also the blood perfuration or capillary refill time is also coming down. And then patient is mostly over the bed. Even the oral intake, either solid or liquid, the patient will have a total detachment from that, and sometimes the patient might be comatose, or they are refusing to take oral medications and oral feeds. Severe cachexia, that is they lose a lot of weight. Trying to recognize a futile or medically inappropriate treatment. So usually, futility is something that is technically used, but the literature actually says that more than the term futile, medically inappropriate is a more suitable terms, so that it makes the judgment much more clear. And futility has been associated with a negative overtone. So therefore, a medically inappropriate is a much suitable term at this point. So, when do you recognize a medical futility? Say, suppose you have a patient who is very elderly and patient's functional status is very poor. You understand that the patient has also underlying diseases like a serious advanced cancer, or some advanced lung disease, or cardiac disease, or severe renal failure. Such patients are termed as medically futile, or the patient is in coma and it is irreversible coma in such cases, or the patient had severe intracranial bleed, or the patient is in advanced dementia, complete vegetative state, or patient already had recently had a respiratory arrest where resuscitation has been done and the patient is again recovered but the neurological status is poor. So there are certain conditions which usually say that the condition is futile and the treatment that you are actually giving is medically inappropriate, because even the survival chances are low and the quality of life outcomes are very much poor. And then we need to have a consensus among the caregivers. So it is not that, when we give consensus among the caregivers, which means that every caregiver has to be on the same page. It cannot be like where one caregiver is coming today, you're talking something, tomorrow another caregiver comes, you talk another thing. It is going to be very different. So therefore, ensure that if there are 3 4 family members, or 2 to 3 people who are the caregivers, ensure that all of them are there and conduct a proper family meeting. So family meeting is not something where you just come out and say that we are going to have a family meeting, but you will fix a proper time. Say, I'm going to have a family meeting at 12 o'clock. Ensure that all of the family members who are caregivers or who are decision makers are all present during that day whenever you're having a family meeting, so that each one understands what is actually happening and everyone is on the same page. So we are doing this so that a difference in opinion does not happen, because today the patients might say that yesterday the doctor has told something else and today they have told you something else, and why is it happening? So there shouldn't be a conflict between the family with regards to the opinions that the doctor gave. And no individual team member should address the family individually. Always ensure that you have your clinical team alongside you, or your nursing staff or any other doctors who are involved with the patient's care are also present along with you whenever you're doing end of life care counseling. The next thing is honest and accurate early disclosure of prognosis to the family. So, early disclosure is important because the family, if the patient is in consciousness, the patient has an autonomy to understand what he wants for further treatment. And also, patient's family should be told regarding the prognosis of what can happen if the patient is in the ICU, or if he is at home, or what cannot happen when you do a certain thing. A clear communication between the patient and the patient family members is equally important, because it is very imperative that you cannot expect one family member to take one decision and another family member to have another difference in opinion. So therefore, an honest and accurate communication is important. So what does family mean? So how does this decision actually happen? So when you have to take about talk about decision making, always a spouse, that is the patient's wife or the patient's husband, as the first line of decision making. This is followed by any other person who is accompanying or who is in close relationship with the patient, also comes on the top list, or someone who is actually a de facto spouse is the medical term that they use. That is, they are all the first line decision makers. The next line decision makers would be adult children, and then followed by adult siblings. So avoid addressing different family members at different times, because you cannot have one family member here and there might be some decision maker who is out of the city. So you cannot address different family members at different times, so that an inconsistency in communication should always be avoided. Try to give as accurate prognosis as possible, and try to avoid terms like 2 days, 1 day, 5 days. Just always say hours to days, or days to weeks. So these are like a safer terminology rather than giving like a pinpoint number. Always explain them the risk, benefit, costs, and consequences of any therapeutic intervention that is being done. And discussion and communication of modalities of end of life care. So, modalities of end of life care, which means that only whether the patients and family are opting only for a comfort care or for like a disease directed treatment. So if they're opting for one such thing, they should be clearly understanding the implications of what that treatment is giving to them, whether such a other treatment options could be a DNR or DNI. Withholding and withdrawing of life supports are other standard treatment modalities. So what are the further consequences whether if they want to opt for it? Because most of the times, even when they say that they want to go with the withhold or withdraw, they do come back with a sense of guilt. So explaining them the medically inappropriate treatment, whatever is going on, we need to explain them, clear their doubts, and elicit their concerns, so that they understand that they are not doing any harm to their loved one. Then we have a shared decision making and consensus through open and repeated discussions. Say, so that a shared decision making is very much important, because it does not put a pressure on a single person in the family. And when you have a few other people who are actually giving their opinions, and everyone is having a shared decision making, it also helps them free from that guilt and anxiety that they eventually have with the patient's medical decisions. So, like I said, family members may express the feelings of guilt or remorse, and it is useful to remind the family that death is inevitable. There might be sometimes cases wherein there might be difficulties in accepting the possibility of death. In such cases, ensure that you have a psychologist along with you, provide assurance, and whenever there is a need, try to alleviate the patient's distress. The most important thing out of the end of life process, I would always stress, is documentation, because all of this is under a medical legal thing. So be careful that a thorough documentation, either trying to, there are some institutes which have an end of life care form, like AIMS New Delhi, like Manipal. Manipal has the Blue Maple form, whereas AIMS have their AIMS end of life care policy form, and certain other private institutions have their own hospital policies for end of life care, where important things such as DNR, DNI, and feed, nutritional support, how much of a nutritional support or a parenteral nutrition should go on, and decision regarding whether aggressive interventional procedures should go on, or regarding blood supports or labs or frequent blood drawings. Decisions regarding these are usually documented on an end of life care form. But if your institute do not have an end of life care, but you are discussing a situation wherein this is happening, in such cases ensure that you document everything, reflect on whatever is happening in the meeting, who all are the other stakeholders present in your meeting along with you, and then who are the other family members who are present in the meeting, what has been discussed, what is the decision that has arrived, and take the date, time, and signature of at least two of the other family members who are there, so that this is properly documented. So, yeah, the other practice points here are communication between the medical team and family, discussion and the final decision, specific modalities, whether withholding or withdrawing of life supports, this has to be mentioned, and this has to be signed by two or more members of the family and treating team. Then ensure consistency among caregivers. So all of them, like I've mentioned, all of them has to be on same page regarding what is the further line of treatment, whether it is a complete supportive care or whether we are going ahead for a life prolonging intervention. So it could be either of it, but they have to be explained regarding what implications would happen when they opt for a certain treatment. And ensure that all caregivers are aware of the end of life care plan that has been made for the patient. Next, you are implementing the process of withholding or withdrawing. So, once a shared decision has been made, this has to be done after a proper documentation, and ensure that if you are planning to shift a patient from ICU to the bedside, ensure that the mechanical ventilation or vasopressors or dialysis, all such aggressive measures are not again carried once they are again back in the ward. So, things such as nutritional, other medications, all of these have to be discussed way beforehand. So ensure that when you shift the patient back, prepare the patient's room, ensure that they are kept in a very comfortable space, the noise level, lighting, temperature. Try to avoid unnecessary medical tests, repeated monitoring of oxygen saturations, or having extra lines, tubes for blood investigations. Discontinue additional drugs which are of no benefit, that is, drugs which are adding to polypharmacy. Ensure that you remove all such drugs which are of no benefit. Review their medications and include drugs which only help with alleviating their distress levels. So, even for the family restrictions, make sure that these are liberal, because they usually, at this phase of life, they usually expect that their extended family members come and visit them. So, make sure that these restrictions are as liberal as possible, and honor the requests of any cultural and religious rituals. There are some patient family members who would like to perform religious rituals, and if you can, if it is in your authority, limit of authority, please do facilitate such religious or cultural events. And Yeah, caregivers could also mitigate the stress of the family by discussing what can be happening during the dying process. So, explain them what can be anticipated during the dying process. Some of the most important symptoms in the end of life or dying process would be pain, breathlessness, sleeplessness, or sometimes they might be very sleepy also. Delirium, especially, usually the textbook says a hypoactive delirium is more common in palliative, but we tend to miss hypoactive, but hyper is usually seen and predominantly noted. So hyperactive delirium or a hypoactive delirium per se is one of the very bad prognostic signs of end of life. Then, what we have to do at this phase, effective and compassionate palliative care both to patient and family members. So, it is not just a physical symptom control, but also respecting the patient's choices, place of care, and any other non physical issues that the patient's family might have. So, what is the scope of palliative and end of life? One is symptom control. Second thing, review the existing care protocols, be it your medical or nursing protocol. Reviewing of the medication charts, routine and unnecessary investigations that may not contribute to the process of care. So, unnecessary investigations have to be stopped, which is not actually benefiting the patient. And throughout the process ensure that a communication happens. It has to be a two-way communication, like an ask tell ask. So as much as possible open and fair communication is needed, because there should be a point where the family comes back to you and says that you haven't told me that this is going to happen. So ensure and explain them what is to happen during that end of life phase. Regarding optimal hydration and food, counseling has to be done, because the literature says that there is no benefit of having artificial nutrition and hydration in terms of prolonging the life duration and also in terms of improving the quality of life. Then psychosocial support to the patient, family, and caregivers, and special requests if they have, like religious, spiritual, or cultural. So these are the symptoms usually encountered at end of life, and try to support a symptomatic management. As far as the patient can take orally, kindly go ahead with an oral medication. If the patient is incapable of taking anything orally, then go ahead with a subcutaneous or an IV line. If you're in a community based setting, a subcutaneous line is as good as an IV line. But during end of life, usually the peripheral blood circulation comes down, the body cools down. So therefore, the absorption of drugs whenever you give a via a subcutaneous route is much lesser and much less fast compared to an IV. But if you are or doing a home based management and you find it a risky for going for IV, then a subcutaneous is as good as your IV. Then what do you do? Providing a proper after death care plan, that is, we call it as a DCP plan, which is a death care plan, which is usually done by the psychologists, the counselors who are there. They help us with preparing a death care plan. So what does a DCP mean? That is, you try to provide the patient's family members with the numbers of the mortuary or the numbers of the box or the ice box, if they have to be transported from one city to another city, trying to arrange an ambulance, giving them the contacts of the ambulance, and if anything happens, providing any reference numbers in case something happens midway. They have to be supported throughout the end point of cremation. So that is called a death care plan. So yeah. Next, a bereavement support. So, end of life does not end at death, but continues even after it. So, bereavement will help the patient's family members cope with grief and other issues. So, such complex grief patterns are usually seen in when the partner usually passes away. It is very imperative that the other partner feels a lot of grief. Someone who has taken care of their loved one for a long duration, and if it's the only caregiver, or if it's a child. So in such cases, the bereavement patterns are very complex, and you need to give them a bereavement call, say 1 week to 10 days duration. Give one or two bereavement calls. They do sometimes break down on the telephonic conversation, but it definitely is a little therapeutic. It's not that we can help them, but we need to acknowledge them, saying that they have done so much for their loved one, and at this point they have been in peace. So acknowledge, saying that they have done a lot for their loved one, and anyone in that place would not have done as much as they have done. So help them cope with that grief, and in case if they have any guilt, so that way your a telephonic bereavement call also helps. Sometimes, if the patient's family members are trying it difficult, ask them to come back to the OPD, visit you again, or someone who is needing a professional counseling, maybe a psychological counseling would also help. Or if it's much more complicated, then a psychiatrist help would be much better for them. Then you will review the entire care process. So this is called the quality activity QA, wherein what gaps have happened during a patient's care process, and try to reflect on the kind of a care that has been provided, be it at home or be it at the hospital. So if something could have been done better in that patient's case, what can be done? So this is like a review meeting. So, what are the ethical considerations at end of life? One is the patient's autonomy, then informed consents regarding withholding and withdrawing care, and at the end, if things are not getting controlled, the worst case scenario is a palliative sedation. So, a conclusion for the end of life topic: one, the outcomes would be a good symptom management, comfortable patient and family, having a proper communication, caregiver comfort and satisfaction, dignified and a good death, providing a good bereavement support, identifying at risk caregivers, and effective management of resources. So our next topic would be on medical ethics. If you have any doubts, please drop them in the comment section, and we will start medical ethics in a while. If you have any doubts, please drop them in the comment section. After this, we will start medical ethics.
Participants, if you have doubts regarding the end of life care, you can ask right now. You can either unmute or you can put it in the chat box. I think there are no more doubts, ma'am. We can move to the medical ethics part.
Okay, it looks like there are no doubts. So let us start with the next topic, that is the medical ethics. So, why is medical ethics very important in palliative? Because palliative deals with a lot of death and dying as well, not just symptom management, but death and dying. So, you need to understand the medical ethics before, because certain things like these are very complicated and very much important, because it also is concerned along with the legal issues. So, what are the four principles of medical ethics? One is autonomy, two is beneficence, three is non maleficence, and four is justice. So, we shall deal with each of these medical ethics principles now. So, first one is autonomy. Autonomy means trying to make one's own decision. So, each one has their own right to take decisions regarding themselves. Some could also be medical decisions. So, having their own decision making capacity is called as autonomy. So patient is informed about his present condition, the risks and benefit of the treatment, and autonomy will help them to make individual decision. It is not that someone else is making their decision, but as a human they have their right to make a decision with respect to the kind of treatment they want, or with respect to kind of treatment they don't want. So this autonomy medical ethic principle also says that they have a right to choose who will be their primary care, like a surrogate decision maker in case something bad happens. So this person on my behalf is going to take a medical decision for me. So they have that autonomy to choose their surrogate decision maker. So, under the law, they are also permitted to refuse the treatment, even if that treatment is resulting in bad consequences. Also, a person who is in a sound mind has a total right on trying to accept or refuse any other medical treatment. The next pillar is beneficence, which is the act of being kind. So, this beneficence is nothing but a practitioner provides in the best interest of the patient. So, wherein you will suggest that this is going to benefit the patient. So, in the benefit of the patient and his family, in you are going to take a decision. So, this is the second pillar, which is beneficence. This will prioritize and promote the well being of the patients. The focus is on trying to provide effective pain management, symptom control, emotional support to enhance the quality of life. Then you have the third pillar, that is non maleficence, which means do no harm, where you should not do any harm. The previous one is beneficence, which is benefiting the patient. Third one is not harming the patient. So it is also called as non maleficence, where commit to avoiding harm and minimize suffering as much as possible. Then what you have to do is try to provide a balance between comfort care and the risk associated with medical intervention. So this non maleficence, which means doing no harm, has to be balanced between comfort care and the risk of any intervention. And the last principle here is we talk about justice. So justice means equality and fairness in the treatment. Say you have a patient who is at end of life, and another patient who is actually very young, and you only have like a single resource of oxygen support available. In such cases, someone who is going to benefit with that oxygen support has to be receiving that treatment, and it is not just because of whether they can afford or not. Am I audible?
Are we lost in between, ma'am? Now you are audible.
Thank you. So this is our fourth pillar, which is justice, wherein equality and equal fairness has to be provided in terms of treatment, not on terms of affordability. Ensure fair and equitable access to palliative services, address disparities, and advocate for resources that will support all the needs of the patients, regardless of the background. So, that is what I have mentioned. Regardless of the background, depending on who would benefit from one particular resource or from one particular treatment, that has to be given a better priority. So, these are the four pillars, starting with autonomy, wherein the patient has their own right and decision making capacity with respect to their treatment choices and who can be their surrogate decision maker. The next one would be beneficence, wherein what is going to benefit the patient and their family. Third one is non maleficence, which is doing no harm. Fourth one is justice, which is equality and fairity in treatment. So, why is medical ethics important in palliative? This is important because you're respecting the patient's autonomy, you're enhancing the quality of life of patient and also their family members, having an open and honest communication between the treating team and the patient, understanding the cultural sensitivity, balancing beneficence and non-maleficence, that is the risk and doing no harm, both benefit and doing no harm, both of them have to be equally balanced. Having an advanced care planning, which means, say suppose something is going to happen at some point in the future, so this is what I want, so that is called an advanced care planning, which means you are planning in advance so as to if something bad is going to happen, so this is my caretaker, or this is my surrogate decision maker, and I want this kind of an aggressive treatment, or I do not want this kind of aggressive treatment, is usually noted down and described in an advanced care planning. And then having a dignity and respect is equally important. And ethics in palliative is something that is going to touch upon having a proper death or a good dying and a respectable death, and addressing the complex decision making processes and enhancing a proper and holistic care. Whenever you have an ethical dilemma, so how do you start? You will recognize that there is an ethical question. You will understand the facts of the situation, understand what all options are available for the patient, and consequences of the options, whether this option is going to cause a benefit or going to cause immediate death or harm. Such things are have to be analyzed. Test the option you plan to take, so whether if you want to take down the patient from an ICU to the ward, so you will have to document it always. Documentation is equally important. Ensure that the patient's family reach a common consensus regarding the care process, and explain the option that you have decided on, and act on the chosen option, and reflect on the outcome. So throughout this process, explanation and proper communication. So if not one family meeting, try to conduct as many meetings as possible, even if it is every single day or multiple times a day. Such things have a lot of ethical and legal implications, so they have to understand the consequences of such a treatment, what whether they are withholding or foregoing such a treatment. So such ethical dilemmas have to be properly documented, and take a proper reflection of what has actually happened, try to analyze, do a quality QA analysis, and then understand what gaps can also be addressed later on. So birth is beautiful and so is death. End of life will deserve as much beauty, care, and respect just as the beginning. Thank you. If you have any doubts, please drop them in the chat box. We shall discuss on the doubts.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for the wonderful session. Participants, today now is the doubt clearance sessions. You can ask your doubts.
Hello, ma'am. I'm
Yeah.
in ethical dilemma.
Okay.
What to do if the family members asking or informing us to not tell the diagnosis to the patient?
Yes. Yeah. So, whenever family says that you should not tell the diagnosis to the patient, this usually happens in cases of a cancer situation. So, this term is called collusion. This is the medical term that we commonly tend to use, where the family members want to shield the information from their loved ones. So, this is also like an act of protecting. So, there are two ways that you can deal with it. Say, if the patient's family is asking you not to tell, in the first meeting you try to respect their feelings and avoid telling it, but explain the family members saying that if your loved one or your patient is going to ask me, I cannot conceal. As a medical professional, I cannot lie to the family member, so I will have to say the truth. If the patient is cooperating for whatever treatment that you are giving, sometimes it is well ahead to go and continue the treatment because he is not interfering in your treatment process. But if the patient is interfering with the treatment process, in such cases it is important that you inform the family members, saying that it is the time that we have to discuss regarding concealing the information. Try to tell him the diagnosis, and if you do not tell, there wouldn't be a proper trust between the patient and the doctor or the healthcare professional. So because you are shielding, certain things are not happening properly and he's interfering with my treatment. So you have to explain this to the family members and then disclose it to the patient. You cannot overrule the patient's family members and then directly disclose it on the patients. It is not usually right, because even in certain situations which I have encountered, when a consent is not taken and you disclose it, it does not lead to good outcome. So therefore, inform the family members, take their permission, and understand why they do not want to tell. So most of the times they say that my family member will think too much, my patient, he will think too much or she will think too much, and they have chances of depression or suicide. Then you will try to address that condition and then gradually break it down in chunks to the patient. So instead of telling directly that they have, but maybe in 2 3 settings, once you establish a proper trust with the patient and your patient's family members have given a nod to please go ahead and tell, in such cases only you are going to disclose. If they are not giving a consent to disclose, we are not supposed to disclose it. It is against the rule.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. So, in our today's session, what we did was trying to identify end of life care. End of life is not just in a few days, weeks, it is usually in a range of months, which is 6 months to 12 months period. So, during this period, when the patient does not have active disease directed treatment, in such a period, at any point of time, they can gradually deteriorate. So, we read about how to identify a patient in end of life, how what are the things that has to be discussed, like with the patient, with the family members. How do you identify this? How do you identify the death process? And we talked about the bereavement support that has to be given, trying to design a death care plan. And then we talked about the medical ethics, which is about the patient's autonomy. Then we talked about beneficence, non maleficence, justice, and advanced medical directives, where any individual can actually go to a notary, get it notarized. Earlier, district magistrate has to be there, they have to be present, but currently, even if you go to any notary, you can get it notarized, and then you can actually write who can be your decision maker or surrogate decision maker in case something happens. Say suppose you want aggressive treatment, or you do not want such aggressive treatment. Such treatments can actually be documented in an advanced care plan. So such advanced care plans have been currently, it's still very nascent stage in the country, but advanced care process has been actively taken an initiative by the Karnataka government in going ahead for this. But people are still trying to understand what implications and legalities this can bring. Even though the Supreme Court has given a judgment on the living will, still people are have to be educated regarding what this living will can do and who all can get it done. Any other doubts?
Is there any other doubts regarding today's session? There are no more doubts, we can wind up the session. So, ma'am, thank you once again for accepting our invitation at the last minute, and thank you for taking the session beautifully for our participants. Thank you so much for that.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
It's the last class, I suppose, for them.
One more session is which is postponed, ma'am.
Okay, okay, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you all the participants for joining today's sessions. Thank you. Let's see you in the next session.